Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. I'd like to tell you a story about a man and his mistress. They had a disagreement, and the angry mistress leaves him and returns to her father's house. After 3 or 4 months, he goes to visit her to persuade her to return home. His father-in-law shows him great hospitality, and after 5 days, the man agreed to go home with his mistress. En route home, the man decides to stop in a nearby city for the night. One of the locals offered hospitality and took them in and gave them food and drink. While they were eating, the local men aggressively knocked the door, demanding that the visitors be sent out so that the men could have sex with them. The host told the men not to do such a vile thing, and instead offered his own virgin daughter and his visitor's mistress. When the crowd of men refused that offer, the man threw his own mistress out to them and closed the door. The mistress was raped by the men all night until dawn, at which point she made her way back to the house and died. When the man came out to go home, he told her to "Get up, let's go." When she did not reply, he took her corpse home and cut her body into 12 pieces. I think we will all agree that this horrifying story is somewhat disturbing on many counts. This story is actually a biblical story in the book of Judges 19. What makes this story all the more concerning is that the authors of the Bible wrote numerous story plots with similar storylines. Let's compare Judges 19 with the Sodom and Gomorrah story in Genesis 19. In Judges 19, a man traveling with his concubine prepares to spend the night in the square in Gibeah. In Genesis, the angels disguised as men go to Sodom and intend to spend the night in the square. A foreigner residing in Gibeah puts them up in his house. Lot, a foreigner residing in Sodom, puts them up in his house. In both stories, a violent mob of the city's men surround the house and demand that the visitors be handed over to them so that we might know them, in other words, have sex with them. In Judges, the owner of the house went out to speak to the men and requested them not to do such a wicked act. In Genesis, Lot went out to speak to the men and requested them not to do such a wicked act. Instead, the host offers to hand over 2 women, his own virgin daughter and his guest's concubine, to the men to have sex with rather than his own guests. In Genesis, Lot offers to hand over 2 women, his 2 virgin daughters, to the men to have sex with rather than his guests. The host is intent to protect his male guests at the expense of his own virgin daughter. Lot is intent to protect his male guests at the expense of his own virgin daughters. In both stories, the mob refuse. In Judges, the man hands over his own concubine to the men who rape and kill her. In Genesis, there's no direct parallel to the story, but Lot's wife is eventually killed and turned into a pillar of salt. In the morning, the man sets off to go home without her, but finds her corpse at the doorway. There's no direct parallel for this in the story in Genesis. The man takes her corpse home and uses a knife to cut her body into 12 pieces and sent a piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. No direct parallel for this in the Genesis story. The story in Judges is very rarely discussed amongst believers because it's hard to read and hard to defend. Given the close parallels of the story in Genesis and Judges, it takes more than a huge leap of faith and ignorance to believe that either story is literal or that there is some moral lesson to be learned, but looking at the arguments defending these stories are also worrying. The emphasis for interpretation in both stories include homosexuality, hospitality, and gender inequality. The notion that people viewed homosexuality or the potential male-on-male rape as being worse than male-on-female rape, since as the Talmud puts it, it isn't his normal way for a man to be put through that kind of experience. The stories were written to add credibility to the non-historical fiction of the moral demise of Israel, as the story starts with, "There was no king in Israel," thus a sense of lawlessness. So the authors try to justify the establishment of a monarchy. Even when viewed through the cultural lens of ancient times, these biblical accounts are disturbing and raise more questions than moral lessons to be learned. No matter people's potential explanations for any small differences between the stories, their core element is the same: prioritizing the hospitality code to protect their guests and offering of vulnerable women as an alternative. We will explore the bizarre events that take place after each of these stories in a separate video. Thank you.